All right, we are still in Module 7 and we're going to move on to Assignment 7B. So just to recap, for 7A, you synthesized your characteristics of the studies, and for the findings, you figured out what way to group the findings would make the most sense for your variables and make the most sense for your reader. And so now for Assignment 7B, you're going to discuss the results. So you're going to discuss those findings, strengths and limitations. What else? Implications for nursing practice, um, implications for research as well for the future. So you're going to be answering the question, what do these findings mean overall? So I don't want the video to be too long, so I wanted to just go over this one. And so I'll just go over my findings from the Loneliness Systematic Review. So here it's entitled Discussion is the section, is what this one is called. And so these first two sentences are always important. So I always like to summarize, remind the reader what the purpose of the systematic review was, because now they're on page 5 and maybe they're just kind of like tired of reading. So you're just reminding them, okay, I've given you all this information. Now, the purpose of this review was to examine the associations of loneliness and cognitive function in the aging population. This next sentence summarizes all the findings. Overall findings from the 10 studies largely indicate that loneliness is negatively associated with cognitive function. Then I went on to talk about summarize the findings from the different domains. So the main findings were significant negative correlations of loneliness and global cognitive function. Now I list the studies: IQ, processing speed, immediate recall, delayed recall. I'll go in to talk about a little bit about the domains, but those first few sentences there sum everything up. So then, you're not just summing it up and that's it. You really need to talk about, well, why or what now? There's more to just, here's the findings. So you can see right here. And so this is where your evidence tables are going to come into play, because I say here, the findings of the 10 studies were surprisingly consistent despite the use of different methodologies to assess loneliness. So if you remember, half of them just asked yes or no questions, and half of them used a loneliness scale. So it's kind of, the message then is, it doesn't even matter, the relationship is so strong between loneliness and cognitive function that it didn't even matter how you measured it. You can measure it simply yes or no, or you can spend 30 minutes and do the loneliness scale. So that's something to think about. That's something that I thought about when I was looking at that. And, interesting, because let's say the findings were all different. And then you could say, well, maybe, you can't make any definitive conclusions, but maybe the findings are all different because nobody used the same measurement scale. So a future recommendation was that people get on board with maybe one certain kind of measurement. Another common measure, let's see, so I'm talking more about loneliness scale. I talk about confounding variables. The current literature does not clarify the cause and effect relationship between loneliness and cognitive function. So one study, though, found that decreased verbal fluency was a predictor. And then nobody talked really about loneliness may trigger prolonged activation of HPA axis to decrease neural reserve. We don't really have much on that. So overall, the causal relationship is not established based on these studies, even though there's a relationship preliminarily established. There's not a causal relationship. And then also, we don't really understand the nature of the relationship. So then I go on to talk about future directions in research. So one thing that was interesting was that most of the studies were conducted in the Western European countries. So I wonder if there was some sort of cultural or social influence there. In general, other countries are known for taking care of their elderly, and Americans are known for not so much taking care of their elderly sometimes. So I wondered if that kind of that was some sort of an issue or an influence. So basically, when you're doing the discussion, just look at your findings, take a step back, look at the findings, and then talk about it in terms of, you might say, these findings here in the systematic review showed this. But when I looked in the literature, some other evidence showed that. And so an example of that would be that I just did a paper on PTSD and horse therapy in veterans as a treatment. And so none of the evidence was really strong to support the use of horses as a treatment in veterans with PTSD, which is similar to what the evidence shows about other populations with PTSD. So children who've been abused have PTSD, and someone who's been sexually assaulted has PTSD. And so in those populations, it's similar that the use of a horse as a treatment therapy really wasn't all that effective. So those are the type of things that you need to kind of talk about and explain and make sense of for the reader. So sometimes you aren't going to have an answer, why were these all not significant? I don't know. But it could be because of A, B, or C. So you really just need to look at your findings and look at the trends and then come up with some sort of way to explain them in a way that makes sense to the reader and makes sense for future people who are going to do research. So I didn't talk about implications. You certainly could. But so then, you'll talk about strengths and weaknesses. So of course that would be talking about the study designs, if they were all cross-sectional. I could say that in mind, that these were mostly cross-sectional and longitudinal, so they didn't establish a causal relationship, but they simply just established a relationship. And that is a weakness, and what we need in the future are more rigorous studies that could establish it. And then also you can look at your sample size. If the sample size are all super small, then you could say that's a weakness. Or if they're strong, if they're really large sample sizes, it's a strength. Implications, that's just take what you found and what would the bedside nurse use this information for. So on that PTSD one with the horse, none of the studies were significant in showing that the horses were a good treatment option. However, the nurse certainly could recommend that as a treatment option if a person expressed interest or a certain love for animals or whatever. It's certainly not off the table as a treatment, but right now we can't say, yes, it works 100%, everybody should do it. So definitely the implications for research in the future for that is that more rigorous studies get done, and definitely a lot more studies. There's only been a few. So I think that's all I have to say about 7B and synthesizing your findings or discussing them. I think another thing that you can think about that will help you is to make an outline. So I like to talk about at least 3 points in my discussion. So I'll go back, this is the summary sentences, and then what are 3 things that you can talk about? That's just a little, not a requirement, but just something that I like to do. And sometimes you might only have 2 things, but I try to talk about 3 things, whatever they are. And so do that, maybe a outline. You can talk to your faculty just to see if they think that makes sense in the same way that you think that makes sense before you do all the work. And I think that's it for now. So let us know if you have any questions, and we will do our best to answer them. Thank you.